A long time ago, in a small village nestled in the heart of Africa, there lived a king and his queen, King Izena and Queen Niora. They were both known for their kindness, meekness, and generosity. Every year, they would gather the whole villagers together and distribute foodstuff to them. The king and the queen stayed for 10 years before giving birth to their son, Prince Kosiamobi. They were happy and grateful to God for blessing them with a bouncing baby boy after many years of waiting. King Izena and his wife made sure that Kosiamobi lacked nothing while growing up, but that did not stop them from bringing him up in the right way and caution him when the need arises. But as time went on, both the king and the queen began to notice some ugly traits in the life of Kesi. They noticed how he was always ordering the palace maidens in a very authoritative voice, despite how little he was, and those maidens were way older than him. Sometimes, Queen Niora would hear him telling one of the maidens that he was the prince and heir apparent to the throne and they should do all that he commands them to do. Queen Niora would wonder where he got that knowledge from. As a little boy, she told the king about it, and the king called Kosiamobi and warned him to stop being rude to the maidens because they were older than him. After talking to him thinking it would stop, Kosiamobi grew worse. He went to the extent of framing up lies against the maidens in order to get them punished, but when the king noticed what Kesi was doing, he stopped punishing the maidens without concrete evidence. Queen Niora was not happy at all about Kesi's behavior, and no matter how he tried to punish him, instead of adjusting his behavior, he would get worse. This continued, and when he finally grew into a youth, he became a terror to the whole community. He doesn't like seeing any villager in the palace coming to beg for anything from the king or the queen. The king and the queen were the type that loved helping people, but because of Kesi's attitude towards those people, they began to do it in secret, because whenever Kosiamobi sees any of those villagers, he would wait until they leave the palace. He would then go after them, beat them up and destroy whatever they must have been given to them by the king or queen. This made the villagers to start staying away from the palace. No one wants to get beaten or humiliated. The palace became dry and unlively as people stopped going there, including the cabinet members. The king became so worried and didn't know what to do. He had to call Prince Kosiamobi to talk to him as a father, but at the end of the discussion, Kesi plainly told him to stop helping people and stop being nice to those people. Kesi told him that all the people wanted was nothing but his wealth, and if he goes ahead helping them, he would continue to torment their lives. Kesi finally told the king that the palace was not a charity organization, and if the villagers needed help, they should go to any of those charity houses and not the palace. And after that, he left the king, who became totally confused on what to do next. He was almost in tears as he thought about why God had decided to punish him in such a wicked way. Queen Niora too was not finding it funny at all. Anoma village used to be the most peaceful place to be, but ever since the birth of Kosiamobi, it became the most dreadful place to live in. There is no passing day that reports of what Kesi did in the village would not be brought to them. Cases like how Kesi ordered his bodyguards to beat up a young man, lady, woman, or even an elderly man who didn't prostrate very well to greet him. Sometimes, he would also ask some maidens he met on his way to kneel down under the scorching sun till the sun goes down. The maidens would stay until maybe when someone finds a way to report to the king or the queen, and when the king asked Kosiamobi his reason for punishing those maidens that way, Kosiamobi would simply reply that it was because those maidens were not beautiful enough. Sometimes, the king would get angry and hit him, but that still didn't change anything. At a point, the queen got tired of Kesi's bullying and she sent him to go and live with her sister in another village, but it didn't take up to a week before the sister sent Kesi back to the palace with the complaint that Kosiamobi was trying to put her in trouble with the way he goes about beating up both girls and boys and forcing them to obey his commands. The king and the queen were deeply bittered and didn't know what else to do about Kesi's behavior. They kept reprimanding him, but things never got better. As days went by, Kosiamobi continued to grow worse. He also learned the new habit of forcing the village maidens to bed, and anyone who refuses would be punished severely. Because of this awful behavior, many people, especially the maidens, began to live in fear. Few of the maidens even left the village out fear because no one wanted to fall a victim of Prince Casey's misbehavior. At this point, the king and the queen began to seek different counsel from different people on the perfect and acceptable way to handle the situation, but none of them did any magic on the prince. He grew worse, and the cases of how he goes about the entire village molesting innocent maidens were coming into the king's chamber almost every hour. The villagers had once gathered in the palace to show their grievances, and also told the king to send Prince Casey away from the village, but the queen went on her knees and began to plead with them to please give them some time to find a lasting solution to it. While she was still on her knees begging, Casey came out with a gun and chased everyone standing their way. That day, the queen cried like she had never done before, while the king was just sighing deeply. They also knew that the villagers would never allow Casey to ascend the throne of Anoma. One day, while all this chaos was still going on, an old friend of the king visited him from a faraway village. The king welcomed him, and after they discussed for a while, the king's friend stated his reason for coming. He told him that his niece ran to his place, telling him how the prince had been terrorizing the villagers and how he had vowed to deflower all the young maidens in the village. The king sighed and told his friend that all he said was nothing but the truth, and he had called and cautioned the prince several times, but nothing had changed. The friend then asked him if he remembered a certain old woman from years back when they were still youths, whom they met on their way back from the stream a long time ago. The king thought for a while and shook his head, meaning that he doesn't recall anyone like that. The king's friend now went ahead and began to remind him of an incident that happened years ago, how they met an old woman coming back from the market with a basket on her head, and on seeing the old woman, the king rushed at her, pushed her down, and ran away with the basket containing some food condiments. The king's friend, who was a youth then, was the one who stayed behind to help the woman up, and according to him, the old woman laid a curse on the king, saying that his offspring would give him sleepless nights and he would be a terror to both him and the community at large. The old woman also said that the king would never be happy whenever he remembers his son. After hearing this, the king was in tears as he remembered everything and how his friend had told him to go and apologize to the woman, but he refused. His heart was full of regrets and his tears couldn't stop flowing. He never knew he was the cause of his son's predicament. As he was still lamenting over what he heard, one of the village youths ran into the palace, breathing heavily. He managed to inform the king that they found a talking stone beside the village river, and the voice sounded like that of Prince Casey's voice. The king and his friend, on hearing this, immediately followed the young man to see for themselves. When they got there, they saw mighty stone beside the river shouting, "Please help me." People were gathered, and the king could not deny the fact that it was Casey's voice. He looked around, and beside the stone was Casey's footwear. He then called out to the prince, and the stone answered saying, "Father, is that you? Please help me, get me out of here." The king nearly collapsed, but as a man, he had to put himself together and do the needful. He touched the stone, pushed it, and even kicked it, screaming Casey's name, but nothing happened. His friend then told him that he knows a very powerful seer who can help his son, but the problem was that the seer lives in a far-away land and they have to journey for 3 days. The king was ready to do anything to free his son, and he readily accepted to embark on the journey. King Izena left with his friend back to the palace. He narrated to the queen what happened, and the queen could not hold back her shouts. She was shouting and screaming round the whole palace. The king ordered the palace guards to hold her and take her to the room. She was pleading with the king to tell her where she could find her son. The king refused, knowing that she would not agree to go back home again until something was done. The queen cried and cried until there was no more strength in her. On that same day, the king got himself prepared, and together with his friend, they left to seek the seer. Though the queen insisted on going with them, but the king refused. King Izena and his friend traveled for days before they got to the seer's house. The seer was an old woman. The woman welcomed them, and the king went ahead to state their reason for coming. After he was done speaking, The old seer shook her head and told him that whatever was happening to his son was as a result of the life he lived in the past, and she also told him that an old woman, whom she offended, laid a curse on him. Again, she told them that Casey tried to take advantage of a maiden who he didn't know was not a human. The maiden warned him to stay away from her, but since Casey did not listen, she turned him into a stone. King Ezena's heart was very heavy. The evil he did in the past were now catching up with him. The king's friend asked the seer if there was anything they could do about it. And the old woman told them to go and look for the woman and seek for her forgiveness. The king shouted, telling the seer that what happened took place a long time ago and the old woman would be dead already. The seer told them that the only solution was to go to the old woman's house. There, they would meet the old woman's daughter and ask for her forgiveness on behalf of her mother. She told them that as soon as the woman forgives him, the curse would leave him and the prince would be made well. Without wasting much time, they appreciated the old woman, gave her some gifts and set out for their journey to the dead woman's house, which was the king's maternal home. They spent another 2 days on the road. Looking for the old woman's house, they kept asking for directions until they got there. And when they arrived, as said by the seer, they met the late woman's daughter in the compound. The king explained himself to her and then he narrated to the woman all that happened in the past, and with a sincere heart, he asked for her forgiveness. Though the woman felt bad over what the king did to her mother, but she still managed to find it in her heart to forgive him. She told the king that she had forgiven him and prayed for him that the curse would be lifted from his shoulder. The king was very happy. He appreciated her and promised to come back once the prince regains himself. The king and his friends stood up and embarked on their journey back to the village. They traveled for hours and neither stopped to eat or take a rest, as they were in a hurry to go back and see the condition of the prince. When they entered the village of Anoma, they didn't bother going to the palace. Rather, they rushed down to the riverside where they first saw the stone. But to their greatest amazement, the stone was no longer there. The king's heart was in great fear as they searched around for the stone, but nothing was found there, and also, the village was unusually calm and quiet. No single person was seen along the road or by the riverside. After a long search, they both decided to go to the palace and find out what exactly was happening. They headed to the palace, and on getting there, they saw that the palace was filled with almost all the villagers, from the inside to the outside of the gates. The king hurried inside and lo and behold, it was the prince who was brought home. According to what he was told, some men were passing by the riverside when the big stone suddenly transformed back to the prince, and he was almost lifeless. They took him to the palace and the queen called the village healer to administer drugs to him. The king was greatly relieved, and after that, he dismissed the villagers and they all went back home. A few hours later, Prince Casey recovered and he was offered a very sumptuous meal, which he ate like a hungry lion. After eating and refreshing, Prince Casey went on his knees before his mother and father and began to apologize for all the wrong things he had done. After they forgave him, he also went ahead and apologized to all the villagers, promising them that the land of Anoma would forever be a peaceful place. The villagers were happy and accepted him with all their hearts. Prince Casey became a very nice person who would go out of his way to make sure that the villagers were comfortable. He joined his parents in helping out the needy ones in the village. He also vowed to restore peace and serenity in the community. The people of Anoma were happy and they loved Prince Casey unconditionally. The king told everyone his story and how his past life led to all that had been happening. They all learned a lesson from it, knowing that what you do today might await you tomorrow. Also, the king did not forget his promise to the old woman's daughter. He went back there with his family and offered the woman a lot of gifts, both foodstuff and cash gifts, and the woman was very happy. The people of Anoma loved each other and continued to live in peace and harmony.